Welcome to Getting the Most Out of Your Clinical Training and Supervision, a panel discussion with psychologist supervisors. I'm Dr. Crystal Eiley, Vice President of the Board of Directors at Psychologists of Color. The mission of Psychologists of Color, Inc. is to increase the number of psychologists of color completing graduate school, becoming licensed, and successfully launching their careers. We offer targeted support services to psychologists of color. At its core, this nonprofit is about racial justice and equality within the field of psychology. I'm honored to be in this space with each of you. Thank you for coming. So now let me introduce you to our panelists for the evening. We have Dr. Wayne Aoki, Board of Directors, Los Angeles Christian Health Centers, Dr. Priscilla Barajas, Director of Professional Development at the Help Group and licensed psychologist at LA Concierge Psychologist, Dr. Vindia Fernandez, Director of Pediatric Neuropsychology at UCLA's Cultural Neuropsychology Program, and Founder Director of the Center for Pediatric Neuropsychology, and Dr. Candace Timmons, Mental Health Consultant at LA Job Corps Center. Please give a warm welcome to all of our panelists, and we're going to begin. All right, so esteemed panelists, given your experience now, what do you wish you had known as a trainee? And we're going to start with Dr. Wayne Aoki.
Thank you, Dr. Crystal. I think when I first started to practice in psychology as a trainee, I was so eager to practice my clinical skills, my cognitive behavioral technique. I think I entered the therapy room, among other things, thinking that empathic listening was just kind of a prelude to treatment, and that the real treatment started after one or two sessions of establishing rapport. And I think what I've come to appreciate now is the need for people to share their stories and to have someone listen with a compassionate ear. And I think I really undervalue that. Wanting to get to the diagnosis, wanting to get the treatment for their depression or their anxiety, rather than really giving them more time. That part of the healing process is indeed to have someone listen to their story, where they've been, what they've been through. And so I think I undervalue the importance of empathic listening. That's one. And the other then with that is the fact that to take a more holistic view of people and their problems, that the problems are not just between their ears. In the last 10 years of my practice, I worked with the homeless population. And, you know, as one homeless man told me, if you're not depressed, there's something wrong with you. And it's that people do live in depressing environments. And that has a huge impact, or have come from some very difficult childhood experiences. And all of these have an impact on what goes on with you intrapsychically today. And so I think appreciating that, taking a more holistic view of mental health, as opposed to strictly an individualistic one. So those two things, empathic listening and taking a more holistic view of mental health issues.
Great, thank you. Dr. Priscilla Barajas, same question. Given your experience now, what do you wish you had known as a trainee?
You know, there's so much I know now that I wish I would have known then, but I'm going to limit myself to like three. The first one would be how important it is to create a professional network. I don't think it was even on my radar as a graduate student. But when I think about a professional network, I think of like opportunities for mentorship, consultation. Even as a licensed psychologist, I benefit from ongoing, consultation around clinical issues, supervision, referrals. If you're seeing clients, if I'm going to attach my name to someone, I want it to be a referral that I can trust. And then job opportunities. It's a small world. That's what I found over time. It's a small world of psychologists, and there's a lot of opportunities that come through word of mouth and from your reputation. So that would be a big one, that you can start creating your network now, even if you're in practicum, and being intentional about staying in touch, like with supervisors and people that you kind of connect well with. The second thing I would say is self-advocating and taking an active role in supervision and training. I think as a graduate student, I was always so grateful to have landed a practicum training position or my internship spot that I didn't think that I could also like ask for what I wanted or, question. And I was more like on the receiving end. And now that I know what I know, and, one area of professionalism is also kind of, self-advocacy and, being active. And then the third one is really basic. And I did not know this, and this is a cultural piece, is you should write thank you notes or thank you emails after interviews. I did not do that. It was not something that, I grew up, kind of doing as a kid in my family. And for those of you who might have a similar experience, everyone else is writing thank you notes and thank you emails these days. So if you choose not to, just know you are in, kind of the minority group in that realm.
Great, thank you. Dr. Vindia Fernandez, thoughts?
Sure. Everybody has made such good points already. I think one thing I would add to the conversation is that I wish I had known that the learning never stops and that it's okay to be humble and admit when you don't know something, and that your supervisors are there to help you through it and to offer either advice or to show you the process for figuring it out. That's what they're there for. And I think that I probably missed out on a lot of opportunities because I felt like I couldn't be vulnerable around supervisors. And that's one of the things I always tell my students, I want to model that vulnerability for you because the learning never stops. Even now, I still consult with my colleagues about different things. Anything that comes up for me in a case that is either confusing to me or I've never encountered. You always have to admit that, there's more to know. There's more to know about something.
Yeah. And Dr. Candace Timmons, thoughts to add?
I would say to challenge yourself. I think everyone has made really great points. And I think practicum is such a great time to learn and figure out the things that you love and figure out the things that you don't love. So working with populations that you weren't so sure about, or working in spaces that maybe weren't your first or second choice, there's still a great learning opportunity there, and figuring out kind of how you want to continue to develop professionally. And I think those are the moments that surprise us and we find new things that we were unaware of, or make connections that are very valuable and important or meaningful along the way. Because this is the time where you're getting all of that support, all of that supervision, all of that guidance. So really like taking advantage of it by stepping outside of your comfort zone.
Yeah, great words of wisdom. Thank you all. So looking back, what are some things you wished you had said or asked of your supervisors that you didn't think to say or ask at the time? We'll start with you, Dr. Aoki.
Okay. Just that question, what question would you ask? I think part of it is cultural. I think Dr. Fernandez mentioned it. Asking a question kind of implied that I didn't know and kind of reflected maybe my incompetence. And so I kind of didn't want to reveal that I didn't know something. I wanted to come across as being competent and capable. And so asking for help was just kind of not a good thing, because portrayed me as being somehow not knowing, or I had the expectation that my supervisor thought that I should have learned all of this in my studies. And yeah, I couldn't realize, even as I approach trainees today, I certainly don't think of them that way. And that, so number one, I certainly would have asked more questions. And certainly one question I would have asked is really, how would you have handled this situation? Kind of give me an example of what you might have said in this conversation. She or he said this, how would you have responded? I've come to know myself that I'm kind of a visual learner. And so I kind of like to see it in action, not just reading about it, but actually seeing a professional in terms of how they might handle different situation, different conversations in therapy. How might they have responded? And so, yeah, so I would have asked more, or give me some examples of how you would have handled this situation.
Yeah, great advice. Dr. Barajas?
You know, as I was reflecting on this question, I was thinking about like a supervisor or, you know, or two who really influenced me. And I didn't know it at the time how influential until you kind of really find yourself and what theories and ways of working resonate. But I wish I would have been able to share that with them, how they've influenced me in what ways. I know as a supervisor, I've always really appreciated when students circle back. Sometimes it's a year, sometimes it's years later, and kind of say hello and mention something specific that we like worked on or talked about. It's always appreciated. It's not necessary, but appreciated. And in terms of the second part of your question, something, that I wish I would have asked, it's more of a general category. And I would say like professional development questions. Sometimes my supervisees ask, like, is it okay if I, bring in questions about postdoc and things like that? And I'm a clinical supervisor, but in my mind, I'm like happy to talk about clinical issues and kind of professional development issues. I know as a student, I definitely would have been served if I brought that more into my supervision. So I think that'll be supervisor dependent, but that is something to explore.
Yeah, great. And Dr. Fernandez?
In retrospect, had several women supervisors as a trainee who were also mothers. And I feel like I probably could have asked them a little bit more about how they managed the work-life balance. As a mother now, I know that it's one of the most challenging aspects of my career and my life. And I wish I'd asked a little bit more about that, those personal questions that at the time I think I would have been mortified to have asked. But being in that position now, I know that I would be completely welcome of any trainee that wanted to know a little bit more about that work-life balance. And I know that some trainees have actually asked those questions, and I feel like that makes for some of the most meaningful connections. And certainly I don't think that I took advantage of those opportunities when I was a trainee, and I wish I'd asked a little bit more about what that's like, because it is tough, it's challenging, and it's something that I still work on every single day.
And Dr. Timmons?
I think my answer is something that I would have never asked for as a trainee, but in reflection of this question and looking back, I think the thing that maybe would have been helpful for me back then was having more like recorded sessions or more feedback sessions to be able to like do some of those live observations and really get that direct feedback of how I was showing up in the room. Because my first practicum experience, I remember just being so ready and like ready to ask the questions, ready to get to the interventions, ready to solve the problems. And then I wonder how that appeared, to the client. I wonder how I showed up in the room. And we would do our, couple of recorded sessions, but in my mind, because there were not as many, I was just always very ready to be like, I'm on it, I'm listening, I'm prepared, I'm answering all of the questions. So I think that kind of took away from maybe those more authentic moments where I was present in the room and getting a different experience as my relationships developed with the clients. So I would say that would be something that I would have asked for more of in retrospect, but during the time I was like, 2, 3 is enough, like, no, thank you, no more, don't want to record myself any more than that. But I think that would be of value now.
Yeah. I think the key takeaway is ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask for what you need. Yeah. So next question, how do you think cultural identity influences the supervisor-supervisee relationship? Dr. Aoki?
As I thought about it, it seems to me that I think the individual both supervisors and trainee, the individual personalities of each individual is the largest factor in the nature of your relationship with each other, as opposed to your culture. And so, yeah, in fact, as I thought about, well, what ways in which culture could enter into the supervisory experience, and most of the examples I thought of were kind of negative. If there is somehow prejudicial perspectives or bias about a particular culture, that would have a negative impact. But be that as it may, you know, as a Japanese American male, I have been told by my colleagues that I think they generously say, I'm direct, you know. I suspect that's how I came across to my trainees as well. Even though I'm offering, quote, an opinion and just a different perspective, I believe they might have taken it as a directive, not just an opinion. And again, I think that's part of my culture. And so, so culture, I think, can, especially for Asian Americans in our audience, things such as the pace of communication for many Asians is a little bit slower. That in conversation, in the majority culture, there's often very little pauses when people are talking. And yet for many Asians who tend to be maybe more reflective, it's not that they don't have an opinion, but their pause in conversation can be misunderstood. And so, so trainees kind of need to be aware of how embedded they are in their own culture and how that affects their style of communication. Nevertheless, I think your personality greatly trumps your culture, because again, we're talking about folks who may have been first-generation immigrants versus folks who are fifth-generation immigrants who are quite westernized. So, you know, there's quite a variety. As many Asian students as I have had, there's quite a range in terms of how they come across, how they interact, and the nature of my relationship with them was very different. Yeah, so depending really on their personality, much more than their culture.
Thank you. Dr. Barajas, what do you think about cultural identity influencing supervisor-supervisee relationships?
I was most excited about this question. I kind of love talking about kind of cultural interactions, and I really see the supervisor-supervisee dyad as being co-created, like a co-created space. And so, you know, Dr. Aoki already mentioned communication. I'm like, I think that definitely influences like communication styles, verbal and nonverbal. And I also think like values and expectations, you know, within the supervisory relationship in the room. So I actually like to start off like supervision with like asking permission and invitation to talk about our similarities and differences. It's one way of like me trying to join with my student. But B, I just found like the more I can learn about them and, you know, like kind of their values, and it prevents misunderstandings, you know, and or when misunderstandings happen, because I find them to be inevitable. It's helped me learn how to like navigate and move through it with my supervisee. So, you know, I can think lots of examples, and some of our panelists have already spoken to it, but there have been trends in my supervision that I've seen with like asking for help, you know, needing to present as competent, you know, taking direction versus kind of asserting one's needs in supervision. To me, that feels like, you know, kind of culturally, you know, intertwined. So yeah, those are my ideas.
Yeah, I love this. I think we lost Crystal maybe. So I'll just jump right in. You know, I have reflected on this a lot, you know. I feel like there's a huge power differential between a supervisor and a supervisee that frequently is misused, not sometimes intentionally, sometimes not intentionally. But when you add cultural differences to the mix, that power differential can be exacerbated, right? Especially when the supervisor is in a position of privilege. And that's something I've had to reflect a whole lot on as a woman of color, because I always saw myself as being one down and, you know, assumed that because I was a woman of color who I identified as indigenous and was an, you know, first-year immigrant or first-generation immigrant, sorry, that I would always sort of be dealing with other folks who had more privilege than I did. And I've had to really check my own privilege. I've had so many amazing trainees for whom English was not their first language, and they didn't learn English until they were much further along in their careers. Or I've had to check my own, you know, perceptions of my in the color, and the fact that colorism is still such a big issue within the Latino community. And I've had to sort of self-reflect on how I come off to other people, and how even though I don't perceive myself that way, that can come off as intimidating to others. And so I think that that's important for trainees to know and understand, and to make sure that, you know, they feel comfortable with that dynamic and can, I love what you said, Priscilla, that the fact that you invite those conversations into your supervision meetings. I don't know that I do that enough, but I think that, you know, it's just such a huge, it plays such a huge role in that supervision dynamic.
Thank you. Dr. Timmons?
I always like to define words because I think that holds so much value and so much power. So when I think about culture, it's so expansive, but then it can also be so narrow and so focused. So as a part of like the orientation that we do at a Job Corps, we talk about the culture of Job Corps and the population that we serve, and how the requirement to get into our program is that they come from a background of poverty, which has its own experiences of trauma and hardship and resiliency along with that. So in that comes a lot of assumptions. And then in us being the doctors comes a lot of assumption of power and of privilege and of our backgrounds because of where we are and the positions we are in at the moment. So during orientation with all of the practicum students, we have conversations about what it looks like to have awareness of that and be present in the room with someone who's going to just throw a bunch of privilege on you, regardless of all of your student loans or the fact that you're working several jobs or struggling or whatever. So there's going to be these assumptions given to you. So it's also being aware of not only how you identify and what's your culture and your values, but how you're being perceived in the room, and trying to speak on it, as several other people have said, and make the playing field about building the relationship together more than it is about the differences in the relationship. So I think that applies in the client-therapist relationship and also in the supervisor-supervisee relationship.
Great, great. Thank you so much for answering all that. Next question. What advice do you have for trainees that have multiple supervisors who have different personalities and approaches to working with clients? And what if their instructions or recommendations contradict one another? I know this happens quite often where, you know, when you're at a training site, you don't just have that one primary, you usually have a primary and a secondary, and can get a little confusing.
Yeah.
Dr. Aoki?
Yeah. Whereas I think actually having multiple supervisors can be very beneficial because you get different perspective, different approaches to clinical issues. Generally, I recommend to my students that they select the cases that they want to share with me, and they really not review the same case with another supervisor. And that, because that will introduce quite a bit of confusion, I think. And so use your own judgment, I think, in choosing which case you want to share with me and which ones you want to share with Dr. Smith. And then you pick and choose. And so we can go over that, number one. And number two, then you can actually go more in depth with some particular clients with me. That you would only share with me and that we would go over together. It's also a way then for me to more legitimately assume responsibility for the management of this particular case, because I'm really helping to direct you in the management of the treatment for this individual.
Great, thank you. Prevention is key for Dr. Aoki, yeah? Dr. Barajas?
I think for students who might find themselves in situations where they have like maybe a primary individual supervisor and then group supervision, because that's been the format in a lot of places I've trained in. They might, if they're finding themselves sharing the same case, amongst different supervisors. I think what I would say as the therapist, I were to see them as like the lead in the case. So really the responsibility to like integrate the information. I would suggest clarifying like roles and responsibilities. So if there's multiple people, who is ultimately the authority, whose license are you practicing under? Because then ultimately I would think that person would have the final call if there's a major conflict. But in terms of like clinical thinking, I actually would hope students would be curious about conflicting information, because in my mind, like that's just very interesting. Sometimes it's theoretical, someone practices one way versus another. But other times it could be, kind of informative about the case or about the team, potentially something happening on the team. Is there someone with like a broader perspective or narrow? It's just interesting to think about. And then I would say, that would be great to bring to your individual supervisor, whoever's the ultimate authority, to kind of think through kind of interesting and conflicting data to make sense of that, or recommendations.
Great. Dr. Fernandez, thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know that I have that much more to add to this question. I think like Dr. Bada has mentioned, I think it's so important to have a healthy curiosity about the process that led to each supervisor's different conclusions. And then just showing an interest in how they got there is the most important part of supervision, because ultimately, and I think a lot of supervisors do this, they'll tell the trainee, ultimately it's your call, but these are the different factors to consider. I certainly do. And, provided it's not wholly unethical or illegal. But I think the process is more important than the final decision in the end. And, I think just showing that healthy curiosity will go a long way.
Dr. Timmons, any thoughts to add?
I would wonder if the differences creates this sense of conflict or anxiety in the student or the trainee, and really kind of assess why. Do they feel like they're being pulled, or that they have to listen to one person versus the other? Are they feeling like both the ideas are good or bad? Just really kind of taking some time personally to reflect on why the sense of conflict or differences feels like it's bringing up any type of distress, or does it feel complementary? And you're like, okay, this makes sense, and then I can add on to this. Like really taking a moment to unpack if it is something that feels helpful or if it's something that's causing stress. And then I would talk to both supervisors about it. I think there's space to be like, well, I heard this from Dr. A, and I'm really trying to figure out how to integrate both, or how to make both work in a way, or can I choose one or the other? And really, I think we all kind of mentioned earlier, asking questions and really talking about what's going on, so that if there is this internal tension happening between two different supervisors, that you can figure out how to move through that and navigate it so it's not damaging to the relationship or cause a strain on the relationship, because now you feel like you can't fully say something, or you want to disagree or challenge a thought.
Yeah, great thoughts, everyone. Thank you. So next question, how do you make the most of a supervision experience that maybe is not quite ideal? Any concrete recommendations, Dr. Aoki?
Yeah, I would hope my student would ask me or tell me that this isn't quite working out so well for me because I need X and you're not giving that to me, or whatever it is. Yeah, speak up, that I may not in fact know that you're hoping to get something from me that you're not. And so by all means, go ahead and ask for it. So my suggestion is to be direct. And if you're not getting something that you would like, yeah, ask for it. And the other then is if the person cannot give it to you or says, that's not my approach to therapy, or that's not how I train my students. If they say that they don't do that, then yeah, take what they do have to offer you, right? Yeah, find what can you glean from your supervision, and just take that and just run with that.
Yeah. Dr. Rajas?
I would love to underline and highlight what Dr. Aoki just said. I'm like, oh, I always hope that people please bring to me, their, whatever upset, or, if there's a misunderstanding. So yes, that would be like my first kind of recommendation. I think other things I could add is I've, worked with a number of students who've told me about some like really kind of nightmare supervision experiences or like placements. And so one thing that I think about is the site and supervisor honoring the training contract? So what was in the description and the training agreement, are they kind of following through with like the amount of supervision? And if not, then there's a couple of avenues. There's the indirect, the more informal kind of, ways, bringing it directly to the supervisor. But I would always say for graduate students, your director of clinical training at your program should always be someone that you can consult if you're not sure how to address it with the site. And sometimes the school will get involved if they need to, if it's like, something maybe egregious. And the other last piece I'll add is that I always hope that, my supervisees will also self-reflect too and kind of think through, like, do they have a role in this if it's like some sort of conflict? And, is there kind of ownership on their end as well?
Yeah, great ideas. Dr. Fernandez?
Yeah, this was a tough one for me. I think it largely depends on what about the training experience is not ideal, because not ideal can be anything from, I'm a pediatric neuropsychologist and I have to train some adult-oriented folks on how to do assessment, versus there are some really, like Dr. Vada has said, egregious, interpersonal issues or negligence. And those things have to be dealt with in a very different way. But I think, barring more of those egregious issues, I think approaching your supervisor with some of the differences that you've identified, or some of the gaps in knowledge, or some of the gaps in supervision that you need, is really, really important, because your supervisor may not be aware of it. They may think that they're giving an adequate amount of supervision, or an appropriate style of supervision, and it may not be what you need. So I think you absolutely have to speak up about those things. And then I had written notes to myself, if it is something more difficult, then you absolutely need to get mentorship outside of that supervision dynamic, because you may not be able to get what you need in that pairing, and you need somebody else who can guide you through it. And don't be afraid to approach other people who may be able to provide you that support.
Yeah, great ideas. Dr. Timmons, anything you want to add?
Everyone said really great ideas. The only thing I think I would add, if it was something kind of egregious, like everyone was saying, going to that level, is if you have the opportunity to check in with your other trainees and peers to see if it is a similar experience, or ways that they have maybe been able to speak to the supervisor to provide a little insight and support. Because I do think there's a lot of value in working at training sites with other people who are going through the process, and having that be another space for support and reflection to really kind of assess the situation, and worst case scenario, utilizing your school as support and seeking outside supervision if necessary.
Yeah, Yeah, great points, everyone. Thank you. So what advice do you have for trainees that might be dealing with microaggressions at their training site? Dr. Aoki?
I would advocate for a more kind of a politely, just bringing it up. Yeah. Telling an individual that how they were offended. I know you took it as a joke, but actually it was a joke at my expense, and I was hurt by that, or whatever. Yeah, I would really just put it on the table and confront it. Yeah, first individually, and of course it's a bigger issue if there's some systemic issues or problems. Yeah, again, you would need to speak up to either your clinical supervisor at your school or clinical training director, or if there's a clinical supervisor that oversees the program at your clinic. But certainly my first approach would be to talk to the individual. And if not that, then yeah. So I would take a direct approach. Yeah, and confront it.
Dr. Rajas?
I had an interesting experience as I was reflecting on this question. I was most disorganized in my thinking. I was like, oh, I was kind of all over the place. And I think it's because I, was most activated by it, because from personal experience, I've been on both sides of the coin, either, someone bringing to me, what they experience is, microaggression, or, being on the other side of it. So I've lived both, and, it's quite activating. When I think about microaggressions, I think, there's kind of multiple responses, and I love Dr. Aoki's, encouragement of addressing it if you can. I certainly know some students who brought things to me that is not, involving me. And when they've chosen not to, sometimes there's I don't know, maybe shame or regret, as if they're they were responsible for speaking up, and I can understand that too. I don't think that's as useful, kind of, for people, within the training experience. I think what I would advocate, my recommendation would be, if the harm that has been caused by the microaggression is getting in the way of either clinical training or the clinical work, then to me, that would be the indication to speak up, to bring, and seek consultation if you're not sure how to bring it up. I'm thinking about what Dr. Fernandez said earlier about kind of authority and the hierarchy and power. And so I certainly know that it's not easy to bring up depending on who's in relationship with you. So just wanted to acknowledge that power differential is real.
Yeah, great points. Dr. Fernandez?
Yeah, I think this is another one of those where sometimes it depends on the person that you're dealing with too. If I were to act in a way that was offensive to any of my students, I would want them to give me the benefit of the doubt, me personally, and I would want them to bring it up to me and allow me to grow from the experience. And that's possible with some supervisors. I think probably, maybe that's the optimist in me. I would say it's many of the supervisors, but it's not always possible. And in those instances, again, I go back to my point from before, you have to have mentors that you can identify with and that you can trust to help guide you through some of these more difficult moments. And with that consultation, come up with a good game plan for how to move forward. And in some cases, you may not feel like you're in a safe space and can, come forward with a complaint or, with a situation that made you feel uncomfortable. But I'd hope that, if that were me, that I'd be given the benefit of the doubt. So I also wouldn't want my trainees to jump 5 levels ahead and not have that conversation with me.
Yeah. Dr. Timmons, anything you want to add?
I think for this question, a lot of my thoughts were who are the people involved? What's the context? What's the situation? And really trying to kind of navigate the best solution. But I think it is trying to build in the clinics and the sites that we work at, systems of accountability where people feel comfortable to speak and comfortable to receive feedback without feeling judged or shamed, and have that exchange be more open, because we all are humans and are flawed and make mistakes. And it's not about calling everyone out in every moment they make a mistake, but how to bring awareness to it so that a change can be made, a boundary can be set, and then you're just growing your awareness around that person's identity and the way that you maybe have crossed the boundary. So I really do think systems of accountability and making that be a part of the space can be really helpful.
Yeah. And to kind of add and reflect on what you were saying, and Dr. Fernandez, like supervisors, we are human. And I think most of us are supervisors because we're passionate about it and we are in that growth mindset. So if we do make a mistake, we want to learn from it and correct it and make changes for the future. I genuinely believe that for most supervisors, but definitely to Dr. Barras's point, like heard some pretty nightmare scenarios where I'm like, oh, that person maybe shouldn't be a supervisor. Yeah. All right. So next question. What do you think is an effective way for trainees to ask for support or accommodations from their supervisor or training site? Dr. Aoki, start us off.
One of the other panelists mentioned a safe space. It seems to me, if there's no place in your clinic or training site that you have a safe space, that's a problem. And that you need to assess that. What's going on here in my training experience? There's really no place that I can talk about the process of training, not about the clients, but the process of the training, which includes the supervision. And then, and because of the power differential in the supervisory experience, oftentimes that almost by definition can't be the safest place, even though I as a supervisor would like that to be a place where they could candidly talk to me about what kind of support they need that they're not receiving. And so I hope I convey that I'm open to any feedback, just as I expect them to be open to feedback from me, that this is a mutual relationship. And I convey a sense that if I'm responsible for the clinical program, I need feedback as to how we're doing, not just me in my supervision with you, but also the whole program. And if the program is not providing the kind of support and encouragement you need, then yeah, that's a problem. And it's my responsibility to address that. So speak to me, be as direct and concrete as possible so that I can actually make changes so that by next week, things are going better for you and all the other trainees. Because if you're feeling it, I suspect the other trainees are feeling it too. So thank you for telling me. And let's see if we can make some adjustments in the program.
Great. Dr. Barajas?
I was thinking about like the question about support and accommodations, and in my mind, it's like they're two different things. When I think of support, I think kind of informally going to a supervisor and kind of maybe asking for, I don't know, extra time or for them to look over certain things. When I hear the word accommodation, it makes me think of like a human resources department and ADA and, kind of legal kind of protections. And so those are kind of two different things in my mind. I think what's never really clear to me is when do you cross over from informal to more formal needs for accommodations. I think that'll definitely be a case-by-case basis depending on the supervising and what the challenges are. I would recommend people taking ownership of their like strengths and their challenges. So, as transparent as you can be, to kind of share not only the things that that you're good at, but then some of the learning challenges. I mean, what most often comes up, in my work has been students with like ADHD, processing issues, and the students who come off as the most professional are the ones who can just really take ownership. Like this is how I learn best. And if you're seeking support, I guess the last thing that I'll say is I would encourage students to have in mind like what types of supports would be helpful. So rather than like, look to the supervisor to offer ideas, like come with some of your own ideas. What would help your learning or your organization or, whatever it is to help for a smoother, training year.
Great ideas. Dr. Fernandez?
Yeah, absolutely. I also thought about that difference between support and accommodations, and my mind immediately went to ADA. I think to add to it, I thought, because this is, as a neuropsychologist, I very frequently have to think about the difference, not just between those two, but between accommodations and modifications, right? So ADA protects you from discrimination in the workplace or in a training experience. And if there are things that a supervisor can do that doesn't qualitatively change the work, then we've got lots of options. But I think it's important for trainees to also understand that we also have some limitations, right? So for most training programs, there are concrete benchmarks that you need to meet to be able to move on to the next step, whatever it is. So, that may be, 1,000, hours of A, B, or C. And that probably still has to happen. So reductions in workload are not often allowable. What was the other thing I was thinking of? An extended leave from your training experience is often not something that can be accommodated without then having to recoup that time at some point or another. Those are things that I think supervisors, are really bound by, unfortunately. But barring major modifications to the experience, yeah, come at us with ideas. What would be helpful? Would it be helpful, to sit down together and come up with a list of your tasks for a week and help you prioritize? Let's do it, always welcome those types of conversations.
Great, thank you. Dr. Timmons?
I think it's really important to make that a part of just kind of the conversation as soon as possible. So if it is an accommodation that you need to perform well in this environment, letting it be known as soon as you can so that you don't have to go through the program, you don't have to go through the training experience without your needs being met, because then it will show up in other ways. And if you're not communicating that to your supervisor, then they're kind of left in the dark about what's happening, what's your experience and what you're going through. And more often than not, we are here with the goal of helping you succeed, and we'll be flexible and we'll work with you within the modifications that we can. So I think it is trying to make sure that you are advocating for your own needs in a training situation, and also recognizing that your supervisors are flexible and adaptable and willing to work with you.
Yeah. Dr. Timmons, I loved how you highlighted like supervisors want trainees to be successful. We're not here to push you down. We're here to lift you up and help you grow. So definitely like the communication piece. I mean, I think across all of our different questions, right? Communication really comes out as something that is really emphasized and will help trainees communicating all kinds of different things in all kinds of different situations. More communication is probably better than less. Yeah.
Dr. Lee, might I add something?
Yeah, absolutely.
And thinking about this question, there was an accommodation I felt like I had to make. It occurred in our seminars where, well, some students are just quieter than others. And, in the pace of conversation, there are several Asian students who just never chimed in. It's kind of a cultural skill as to how to enter a conversation. And a lot of quieter students wait for a pregnant pause. Well, in some of our seminars, there is never a pregnant pause. So sort of as a facilitator, I had to slow the conversation down. I just said, okay, we need to hear people out. Let's hear from those who haven't had a chance to say much, or something like that, We need to give other people a chance to chime in, because otherwise, I wasn't sure if they just didn't understand, they didn't care, they weren't interested. In fact, many of them were just thinking about it. But by the time they think of sharing their opinion, it's already 2 topics down the road in the conversation. And so how do we then? And so for those of you in our audience who are quieter and don't speak up as much, and don't just jump in, over speaking someone, then yeah, you may need that accommodation. So that's one I frequently had to employ in my seminars. I just say, okay, let me hear from some of you who have not had a chance to say something, and pause it. Yeah.
Yeah, great point. Anyone else like have a comment they're dying to share, like, oh, this made me think of something else? All right, so those were the core set of questions that we had. So I'm going to open it up to Q&A from the audience. If you have any questions, send it in the chat to, I think the person's name is chat here or questions chat here or something like that. Send your questions their way and they will share them with me and I will share them with the panelists. We'll give you a few moments to think and reflect. All right, so it looks like we don't have any questions yet. Not to worry, there are more questions that I have. So for our next question, what would you recommend to trainees who are looking to connect with psychologists further along in their academic or career journeys? So I think this is really kind of tapping into, how do I find a mentor? I think that's a big question trainees tend to have. Dr. Aoki?
I had mentors from my own school. They were often TAs that I knew and got to know, and they were good 4 or 5 years ahead of me. And yeah, and many of them stayed in the LA area. And yeah, and we actually became good friends after I graduated, became licensed, and we're practicing together. And we stayed in touch as alumni from the same school. So certainly I would look to your own schools with upperclassmen as potential mentors for you.
Yeah, that's a great point, Dr. Aoki. A lot of times when we think of mentors, we're thinking of people far ahead of us in our career, but sometimes it's just, people a few cohorts above us.
Yeah.
Dr. Brajas?
I would highly recommend joining professional organizations. Join LACPA, join CPA, join, Psychologists of Color, join and then get involved. Like usually there's special interest groups or, different ways to volunteer, as part of the professional organizations. I think that leads to like some more informal interactions, and that's how you really get to know people and make your connections. So I know at this point in grad school, it probably feels like an additional thing to do. So you can even start with the student membership. Those are usually highly discounted as opposed to licensed psychologists when you join. But I would say my professional organization membership has been invaluable in terms of connecting with others and then staying on top of what's happening out there, different changes and requirements, for licensure, and so that's key.
I'm also a big fan of local professional organizations.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I will also add, find somebody who has your ideal job and then invite them out to lunch. I think in the hospital setting, certainly when things are really fast paced, it's hard to really get your supervisor to be candid and comfortable and about anything, mostly because you're just thinking about the task at hand. So it's good to get supervisors outside of that environment. And you'd be surprised. I think most supervisors would welcome an opportunity like that to just just have lunch outside of the hospital setting or outside of whatever setting it is that you're working in. everybody has to eat.
Dr. Timmons?
I would say if you are wanting to like build on a relationship or an exchange that you've had in any setting, to reach out to people, or for lunch or for coffee or over an email to provide an update. It's those small moments of connection that people appreciate and remember. So even if it's a brand new person, we all have to reach out to a brand new person as we're writing our dissertations. It's like, hey, stranger, you want to read this paper for me? So you have that skill as well. So it's just like, if there is a psychologist out there that you are inspired by or want to connect with, it may not be hard to find their information and just say that. And worst case scenario, they don't respond, but you tried. Best case scenario, you get a response, you build a relationship, and that becomes something that lasts throughout your entire career. So like, it seems like it's worth a shot to try, because you never know what the outcome is going to be on the other side.
Yeah. Shoot your shot, right? Like, don't self-reject. And I will add, like if you reach out to someone and maybe they do respond, but say like, oh, sorry, I don't have time. Like, don't take that as like a rejection. Like they might circle back to you when they do have time. Like oftentimes I know people will reach out to me to do lunch or coffee, and I'm like, right now I don't have time, but I invite you to circle back to me in like a couple months when I think my schedule will open up, or I'll try and remember to circle back to you when my schedule opens up. Like oftentimes it's a logistic issue. Like I really do want to meet with people and provide mentorship and, usher people into our profession. But sometimes I'm really just like overbooked and it's just bad timing. It's not disinterest. Yeah. All right, so we have some questions coming in. What were the most challenging parts of your supervision experience? And I'm just going to open this up to everyone to give you some time to think, and whoever wants to answer can chime in.
I'll start. I was thinking about the not ideal experience, and when I was reflecting upon my own experience, I just had a supervisor who was very hard to communicate with consistently. Like we had our designated supervisor time, but outside of that, it was really like challenging to be able to connect or ask questions. And I'm a question asker. Like if I don't know, I want to be able to like send you an email or a text message and be like, what's the answer? If I can call you, hey, you got a little time? So that was like a really hard experience for me. And that's when I started to seek support from peers and mentors and question whether or not I needed to get additional supervision so that I could find ways to still get those answers and feel supported in that network, even though my supervisor was like, I'm doing the thing, I'm fitting in the boxes. It's really hard for me because I was like, I don't like boxes, like I'm more of a wiggly shape that keeps moving, and I need someone to be able to like be present with the wiggle. So that was a really hard supervision experience for me, but it also taught me to recognize that there's more than one source for support or an answer, or if I really don't know, I could research it endlessly online, but that has to have a stopping point as well. So really recognizing kind of the ability to get what I need from more than one source was kind of the takeaway from that not so great supervision experience.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah. Anyone else?
I had the challenging experience where my primary supervisor, we pretty much taking a cognitive behavioral approach. He went on vacation. And so I got reassigned to a very psychodynamic, almost psychoanalytic therapist. And we're just talking two different languages. Yeah, I mean, I walked out of there thinking that, or had the impression, as far as she was concerned, I was not even doing therapy. What I was doing, was not therapy. So, I mean, I felt badly about it. I just took it for what it was worth. She's signing off on my cases and my notes. And And she had just a very different perspective of my clients and how to approach treatment. Yeah. So I just took it for what it's worth. But after 2 sessions, I was done. But that was, well, it was hard, yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Fernandez, I think you were about to chime in too.
Yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this story. So I've had some really tough training experiences where I've had a supervisor who really wasn't meeting expectations. It's sort of like what we were talking about earlier, where if you look at your training plan, you look at the type of supervision you're supposed to be getting, it's definitely not happening, right? And moreover, it's causing ethical and legal issues with the client. So, I've been in some really, really tricky situations. And, the way that I dealt with it at the time is not something I would recommend. At the time, I really felt like my job as a trainee was to, keep my head down and, do the thing and, just finish. And I think that caused a lot of distress for me in the process.
Mhm.
And it's not something that I would want my trainees to endure. And if you have an opportunity to speak up, get mentorship, get supervision from, another person within, that same organization, that's what I would really recommend. Training is not something you should just endure and survive. That's not the point of a training experience. And I think most people are there to be supportive and to make sure you come out of that experience stronger and better, and that it's a fulfilling experience in the end. So again, I don't know that I dealt with it the best way, and I would want my trainees to deal with things a little bit differently.
I appreciate you sharing, Dr. Fernandez, like what you wish you had done differently, right? Like at the time, we don't always know what to do, especially as trainees. Like it can feel very daunting. Like maybe you think you know what you should be doing, but it's definitely another thing to actually do the hard thing, right? Like that can be incredibly scary, especially with power differentials and, worries about repercussions and, what are people going to think about my professional reputation if I do this? I don't want to be the one that rocks the boat or whatever. And I think a lot of us who are further along in our career looking back probably wish we rocked the boat when we needed to and self-advocated when we had the chance. All right, next question. Does anyone have any supervisory experiences that really stand out to them that they can share, and what made those experiences valuable? Could be, you as a supervisee or when you were a supervisor. It's a tough question. This one requires some thought.
I definitely feel like some of the most rewarding experiences I've had came from a supervisor who cared about my process and asked me to bring something to the table. I'll give just a quick example. I remember when I was starting to develop my bilingual assessment experience. I didn't have a whole lot of folks I could turn to. And I had a supervisor who said to me, what kind of battery would you put together for a pediatric bilingual child? And I remember at the time thinking, like, I don't know. Well, think about it. Come back to me with this, and then let's have a discussion. But I want you to give it some thought. And I remember feeling really supported. Even though I was being challenged in the moment, I also felt supported and like somebody was taking the time to help me develop this skill. And they didn't leave me hanging. They said, come back to me. And then I want to have a discussion about this. And it felt really rewarding at the time. I remember that stuck with me.
Yeah, sometimes supervisors, the best thing they can do is push you a little bit, not give you the answer right away. Like it maybe as a trainee doesn't feel good at the moment, but like we promise we're doing it for your growth and not to be mean.
I was thinking about the person who's like really standing out, and I identify, as a family therapist. And so my exposure to it during practicum really brought the theory that I learned in class to life. And once my supervisor joined me for a session and really modeled, so we did kind of family therapy together and like co-led, and like that was a real like kind of, big moment for me to feel like I could sit next to him and co-lead, and for him to really join with me in that way, and then just kind of to model what this looks like. I think I learned a lot of like kind of evidence-based treatments, and so it felt a little bit more prescriptive, and this kind of felt really different. It really kind of opened my mind to what therapy could look like, and so yeah, that really stood out, him joining me, and modeling.
Yeah. Any other experiences people want to share?
I was trying to like think about ways that I could like narrow things down, because I was like, well, from my perspective as a trainee, I remember the value I felt from when I was doing my postdoc, and then my supervisor was like, "You're done," and I was like, "I'm not ready to be done. What are you talking about?" She was like, you know what you're doing. You're doing this almost independently. We check in and have conversations about it, and your hours are done. You're done. And it was the push that I needed to kind of move to the next phase of things for me, because I was so used to the process of supervision and having that space for consultation or to check in or to just really get some feedback in ways that is always really helpful and valuable. But now I needed to shift that from supervision to consultation. So it was really hard. I spiraled a little bit when she was like, "Okay, this is it," and I was like, "Well, excuse me," but it was really helpful because it reminded me of my competence. It reminded me of my skill set. It reminded me that I was ready, even though I hadn't fully put all of those pieces together. So then I started my chapter of my journey of being a licensed person, and I was like, "Oh, I did do all of the things. I am done," which was a really nice moment, because it was so simple, but it was so like affirming and powerful at the same time.
Yeah, that sounds extremely affirming. Like, whoa, they think I'm done? Like, okay, I guess so.
Are you sure?
All right, I'll ask one last question for the panel. What do you think are some of the pitfalls to be aware of as trainees transition to licensure or private practice?
I did private practice for maybe 2-3 years, and I didn't like it. It was too lonely. It was really just too lonely. I had to really work. I mean, some of the other panelists talked about getting a network together and going out for lunch, and I just didn't do that. And so I just didn't have enough of a strong network. Or actually, at the time, I didn't even think of it. That I got together with my golfing buddies, but spending the day, really, yeah, by myself, having lunch by myself between clients. I mean, so my experience of private practice anyway was that it was kind of an isolating experience. And even though I had other colleagues in the suite of offices that I used, it was just hard to get together. And so anyway, so one of the pitfalls, one of the challenges is exactly what some of the other panelists have talked about, is join associations and get colleagues that you can touch base with, because otherwise practice is very isolated, so.
I would say one of the pitfalls is not betting on yourself. I think that the imposter syndrome that you have in graduate school, and then as an intern, and then as a postdoc, it doesn't go away when you get your license and you're off on your own, because then you're an early career psychologist and you think you're just faking the funk. Bet on yourself. At that point, you've got the skills, like Dr. Timmons was saying, you know, you have to have that confidence. You're worth the fee that you're charging, and ask for it and demand it. That's not to say that you can't make room in your practice for pro bono work and sliding scale, and for making sure that you have practice that's accessible to various people. But bet on yourself. You can do this. I think that's what I see most trainees really struggle with their first year out of postdoc.
It's so fascinating to hear how everyone responds to these questions, because my response will take it in a different direction. I think of law and ethics. So like when you're licensed, law and ethics is not just a course at school. You have to like protect your license. So really make sure all that good training that you got with, you know, multiple relationships and boundaries and documentation, take it on the road with you. Because ultimately, you know, it's going to be your responsibility and your license that is, you know, on the line. So anything to do with law and ethics is like, you know, that's where my mind goes to, and consult if you're not sure.
And just to add, the word that kind of caught me in that question was transition, more than anything else, because it is a process of stepping into something new and unknown, and that can be scary and funky, but it is also losing a sense of comfort and a sense of security that we've had. And I think that that space in between, once we get our doctorate and once we get licensed, I don't think people talk about it as much as they should, because there's space. It isn't just like a boom, boom, one after the other. And that process, I think for me was really, because I was so used to, all right, next site, next site, next site. And then it was like, so what are you going to do? And I was like, no one's going to tell me what to do anymore. So really having some, you know, awareness of like what that transition into the space where you are now the boss, you are now taking care of yourself, you are now deciding what your early career path is going to look like is important, because that step 2 licensure still needs the work of studying for our exams and paying for those costs and supporting ourselves and getting the training hours to happen in between that. And sometimes that move from pre-doc to postdoc isn't always that seamless. So I think thinking about the transition steps and how to take care of yourself holistically while studying and getting these hours is an important part to be aware of in the transition to licensure or even private practice.
Yeah, absolutely. The time of when your grad school ends and licensure, there's like a year or two in between, right? So I think, and that's not something I felt like I was prepared for in grad school. Like in theory, I knew I had to earn postdoc hours, but in like practicality, logistics, whatever, I really didn't know what that meant. I didn't even know what the process of licensure was until like a seminar I had in my pre-doc internship. Like I had no clue. I was clueless. It's not something we talked about in grad school. Grad school is really like, let's get you through and get your doctorate, and then now you're kind of on your own. So I think what we were talking about earlier, like connecting with other peers who are further ahead in the program than you, finding mentors, linking with people in your professional organizations, like those are ways to kind of navigate those limbo times where maybe we don't have the guidance anymore or the structure anymore, and you're kind of left on your own to figure it out. All right. Thank
Dr.
you.
Timmons' comment, I want to ditto her comments as well as yours, Dr. Lee. That I remember after licensure, it was kind of a time of almost depression for me. That the loss of the structure. I mean, you spend all these years with these goals, you know. I always had a goal. There was something to achieve. And all of a sudden, they were gone. And yeah, I remember that, yeah, right after licensure, that I crossed the last hurdle and a feeling of being lost, almost depressed, not having that structure on me.
Yeah, so now what? Like, I achieved it. Now what? Great. Thank you so much to our panelists. Really, really appreciate you taking the time to volunteer to provide guidance for this next generation of psychologists of color. I'm going to pass it along to Dr. Ketty, who will be kind of wrapping things up for us.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. And thank you all so much for being here. Like Dr. Lee said, I'm echoing just your volunteering to be present here and share your wisdom. And I know that so many of the trainees that are here right now and who will watch the recording later will really benefit from hearing what you all have shared. I always, I'm sitting here listening and thinking, man, why didn't things like this exist when I was in grad school? To learn from and hear folks who have gone through it and who are, doing this work now. But I'm so glad that we have been able to hear from you and learn from you right now. I just want to quickly introduce myself. I am Dr. Norma Cady. I'm one of the board members of Psychologists of Color, Inc., and I'm also on the programming committee. And I just, a couple quick highlights for me from hearing you all speak. It sounds like, early on there was a theme I think that a lot of you spoke about, which was, wanting to kind of save face and this, challenge with being vulnerable in the supervisory relationship. And I think that is just such a common experience, and even more so among trainees of color, children of immigrants, a lot of the identities that we all kind of identify with. And so I really appreciated you all bringing that out and kind of normalizing that experience, and sharing kind of the importance of bringing your holistic self into the supervisory experience in order to really benefit, from that experience. And also, talking about the value of self-awareness, and knowing what you need, and asking for it. And so those are just a few of my key takeaways, but I'm really appreciative of all that you all shared. I'm going to close us up with just some quick kind of logistical pieces to share with everybody. So there is a post-event survey that will be posted in the chat. We really want to hear from the folks that are here as participants, so that we can inform future programming through the feedback that's provided. We also want to share that, we as an organization want to continue offering free events, and tax-deductible donations will assist us with providing resources for our communities. There will also be a link in the chat if you choose to donate tonight, and you can also find that link on the Psychologists of Color website. There's also a needs assessment. So we are seeking information about the needs of current and future psychologists of color. We will use this information to guide our programming and initiatives to meet those needs. Please be on the lookout for an email from Psychologists of Color with a link to our needs assessment so that you can help guide our mission. And we have more events lined up. We are attempting to do at least one program a month. So we want the folks that are here and the folks that listen later to stay engaged with us. Please follow us on our social media platforms. The links for that will also be provided in the chat. So with that, I just want to, again, thank you all so much for being here. And I hope that you all have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you all.